trying to roll with.
What was that?
I've just been keeping it like this and trying to roll with keeping
Okay.
it.
Okay, we've got such a huge audience here at 7 o'clock in the evening. I thank you for holding out with me. This is going to be a short presentation because I know it's late and we're all looking forward to moving on to other things in our evening. Okay, strange interactions and personal data. It's, first of all, who am I? Blah, 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 whatever. My standard disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. Don't look to me for legal advice. I like to talk about the law, but I'm not a lawyer yet. And then I have fine print and practicing fine print. Okay, my extra double safe disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about things that are illegal and how wonderful they are. Don't try this at home. Don't come crying to me if they find something to stick on you and make your life really hard. Hopefully this will make a difference in the fight against the current incarnation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I've been actively campaigning against, or for change rather. And this is my little contribution because I do privacy and I'm for change of the computer laws. So, what this is about, it has a weird title, a new way of looking at legal structures. When you go to law school, they teach you a really staid, traditional Socratic method, looking at cases, interesting cases, but everything you look at has already happened. They don't talk about potentials. They don't talk about what could be, because that's irrelevant in the practice of law. But I'm kind of a hacker at heart. So I like to think of things in the way that they break down and interesting ways that that happens. Okay. So this is a point I raise with people that are hackers, that they have a lot of trouble wrapping their head around. You can't own data. They're talking a lot about copyright and intellectual property protections and all this, but you can't own data. It's just...
My company owns a lot of data.
Your company does not own data.
I guarantee you that they...
Your company might have trade secrets. Your company might have specific arrangements of data, but you can't get legal protections for that data if, say, somebody stole it. If somebody stole it, the only, I'm actually getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Copyright doesn't mean anything with personal data. Trade secrets. Trade secrets are probably what your company would claim. Your company owns a lot of data, but it's because it's valuable business information. And the trade secret law is written so that if it's not valuable business information, then you don't own it. It can't be owned. There are a few patchwork laws that define privacy, but legally, there's no law that attaches to data for ownership.
So you can say like we can possess data, but not like land rights, or we can own land because the government says that we have that right.
That's precisely it. The government will not support protection for the right to hold that data.
You can still possess it, you just can't say like it is mine and no one else can have it.
Exactly.
And the government will go like do things for you on your behalf. They won't.
Right. The idea behind not owning data is that the data, intellectual property protections are not meant to limit human knowledge. And that's something that the framers of all this information really had in mind, is they did not want to limit the knowledge that's available to humanity. That's why mathematical equations can't be patented or copyrighted. And they're going back and forth about the gene information. And they recently struck down protections for genes because that's knowledge. that's not information that can be protected legally. So, what does this mean? It kind of gets complicated when you start talking about personal data and ownership. So, next topic I'll bring up is data brokers, and which is kind of the bulk of this. The idea that the data broker, that's the business, is buying and selling data. Some of them sell personal data, some of them sell property information. There's a data broker I researched that sells information on rights of way, which is a hugely complicated process. If you want to run lines anywhere, you have to find each little property owner along the route that you plan to take, and it's very difficult, but they provide a service that do that. Most data brokers buy data from other brokers, and going back to the whole statement that it can't be owned, they buy data as a service, they buy data in a specific arrangement in connection with other data. They go through a lot of manipulations to try and explain how this data is connected to each other and that they have the right to buy and sell it. So, data brokers don't particularly care where information comes from that they collect and sell. As far as the quality of the information, it's very important that they get good quality of information, but it's not important what the source of that information is. And let's not underestimate what data brokers are and can do. There are some really huge companies out there that you probably have never heard of. Well, you might if you traffic in data.
Yeah, I could say that I know one of those companies very well.
I know all of the companies very well.
So, some of them are kind of surprising. Reed Elsevier, the people that keep all the academic journals behind paywalls, also collect personal data, and they primarily sell it to lawyers. And then Equifax and Experian, these are two of the three major
Credit report
agencies. Axiom is actually the largest company on this list, and they've been around for a very long time. And unless you're in the industry, you've never heard of them. I've spoken to people who are in they're hackers and they're dealing with a lot of questionable people, and so they investigate people on a regular basis, and they connect with a lot of databases, and they've never heard of Axiom. They were glad I mentioned them, so they're looking them up. But since Axiom really does a lot of wholesale data sales, so a few of those are regulated. The specific uses, loans, credit reports, housing and employment, these are protected categories where you have a right to access the data they have and correct it if it's wrong. I frequently have to because I have a common name and people like to stick things. I'm still fighting an MRI that showed up on my credit report, but I don't know where it is. But like the Axioms of the world avoid this regulation by avoiding those specific uses of the data. They tend to focus on marketing a lot. I was looking at some others that valuations, they work with insurance companies for their actuarial information. They work with universities. I had somebody, apparently they'd seen I'd been doing research on data brokers and they tried to sell me information from India that I'd never heard of. So they're out there, they fly under the radar, and they're totally unregulated. In fact, it's even very hard to define them. So, what's the big deal? Data provenance, where the data comes from. There are consistent industry-wide practices. Competitive advantage. If you tell everybody where your data comes from, they'll just go to your source. They'll bypass you even if you have advanced data analysis techniques, it still puts you at a competitive disadvantage if you've revealed all the sources of your data. What's really interesting is Congress held a hearing about 3 years ago on data broker practices as a result of a murder-suicide based on a rather unfortunate stalking event. And the data brokers came in, and every single one of them, there were 9 of them, every single one of them pled the fifth. Congress can't do anything about that because that's a fundamental right, but they're not telling. The only data that comes straight from the source, even if, well, we get our data from Facebook and these others, you'll never hear that. Only the data that comes straight from the source is identified as being from the source. So the point is that the provenance, where the data comes from, is not important. What's important is the quality. If you have good quality data, then you have a good quality product. And if you collect data from many, many sources, there is getting it now. If you collect data from many, many sources, then just attaching the source to the data that's another data field in your database, and it makes things pretty tricky.
I can tell you from personal experience that provenance is extremely important to data brokers, because how much they have to pay to use that data in their data products is directly related to where they got that data from. So the things that you're talking about them not tracking, they are absolutely tracking in a very finite way.
Okay, so they pay based on the source of their data.
Yes, so
Maybe
they're
not the implications of where the data came from. I mean, other than the very little regulations, but yeah, I mean, it's all about revenue, right? So
right.
Yeah.
So if they
Yeah.
have the same data from 2 different sources, they are going to claim the least expensive source as the source of that data,
Right.
so that they pay less for it. And there's actually a significant portion of the business, in fact, that's where that business grew from, was providing you the data that you want from whatever source I get it for the cheapest price possible. So they take all the data sources, they deduplicate that, and then they find the cheapest way to get you the data as the customer that you are looking for.
Great, great.
So provenance is definitely important in all.
Provenance is important, but provenance associated with a price. So you're not tracking where that third party that got the cheaper rate for the data.
Right, so we are not tracking it back to its source. We are
Exactly,
tracking, right.
exactly. And that's my point, is you're not tracking it back to your source. You're just the incoming vendor, whichever source of data you get, that's what's important. So, what if somebody stole data? What if somebody figured out a way to break into a system? Because personal data is low man on the totem pole when you talk about securing personal data, or when you talk about securing data. Recently, it's been recognized, a lot of startups recognize this as their revenue source. But I've spoken to many, many, many startup people who don't recognize the need to protect the personal data. They recognize the need to protect the credit card data, PCI compliance, social security numbers, all the financial information that's attached to their customers. They recognize the need and importance to protect that, but they don't have the force of law behind the protections for personal data. So it's the low-hanging fruit of the break-in scenarios. Many companies, I've worked for companies that are not very good at protecting this because it's expensive. It's expensive to hire all of us technical hackers to make sure that everything is secure. We don't always come cheap. So, so the risk is much lower for seeking personal data. But it's obviously worth less financial data, but data brokers are buying. Maybe you won't be able to approach Axiom because they're very good at knowing their source and knowing who they're dealing with. They've managed to avoid Spokio's problem. Spokio is one of the data brokerages who they got in trouble with the Federal Trade Commission because they weren't careful who they sold their data to. And the FTC had their mystery shoppers go out and buy Spokio data for employment, and they got some really ugly fines because Spokio, unlike the three major credit agencies, does not give you the opportunity to review the data that they have on you free of charge and contest any errors that they might have. There are certain types of data more valuable, like images. There was an article a while ago about Target stores identifying a pregnant teenager before the father that she lived with did. And the reason they targeted that particular life event is because you make a lot more decisions about what your future life is going to be when you make major changes. When you're moving, when you buy a house, when you buy a car, you buy a lot of things. And you're great target material for advertisers. Also life insurance companies and other organizations, or any insurance company for that matter. All these organizations want this information so that they can make decisions. Further, they like to have neighborhood information to when they start talking about expanding their business. Where should they expand next? So it's very valuable. This is a huge industry, and the more of it you can get, the more money you can make. And what's interesting is, unlike stolen financial information, you don't need to scrub it. You don't need to launder it. You don't need to go through third parties. If you set up an organization that looked legitimate on paper, you could set up your own data brokerage based on stolen information. You'd have, there's a little bit of a gray area, legal gray area there, where you know and don't know, or maybe you just find a global friend. And there's no risk to the buyers because data cannot be owned. The buyers are not buying stolen property. Unlike any other property that gets filtered through the system, that property, once it's stolen, remains stolen and is recoverable, and all the people who buy and sell it are liable. But data doesn't fall under that because data is not property. You can set up a totally legitimate business, get real paychecks. You don't have to worry about money laundering at all. The only legal concern is, with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, getting caught. And getting caught, if they're not protecting it, if you're smart about it, you might be able to avoid that. So the hacker value equation: low difficulty, low risk, moderate payoff, clean money. Seems like a great idea to me. And so what also comes up is there's no way to independently test this. If you give somebody your personal details, you don't know what they know about you or what they're giving away even. The financial industry, the PCI compliance game, that's pretty easy to evaluate because the banks are in control of that, and they're the ones who have to pay if things get stolen. But nobody pays if somebody's selling your personal data. And there's a lot of argument about what is the value loss if an insurance company finds out about you, whether it's true or not. So consumer protection organizations, I like consumer reports, they're neutral. they don't work with people, and they do independent testing. There's no such thing as independent testing for data security. You either contract with the company or you don't test it. And so the FTC can come in and has come in with consent decrees against organizations who poorly protect or ignore privacy protections. But it's a really big hammer. They're not going to go after the little startups that have been collecting a few people's data, a few thousand, a few million people's data. They're also based on a complaint system. Unless you can independently test, you can't bring the Federal Trade Commission in. So the only hope is really somebody who is actually leaking the data notices that it's leaking and does something about it. So maybe you're concerned about this. What would a hacker do if you suspected that maybe somebody was not treating your data responsibly?
You may have to speak a little louder because unfortunately the air conditioning is going to overwhelm you.
Oh, okay. Okay. So if what would a hacker do? What would a hacker do if you were if you wanted to know that your data was safe? Is you would test it. I would. I want to. But Computer Fraud and Abuse Act says no thanks. You can't do that. You don't have the authority. In fact, recent prosecution, Andrew Arnheimer, also known as Weeb, he wasn't testing his own data, but it was privacy information that was being leaked by AT&T that he got convicted for 3 years. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act actively prevents people from testing and validating that the systems that they trust, that they have every reason to trust, are safe, are secure. But what's interesting is even the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, considered this really oppressive anti-circumvention preventions where you can't break into something if it might protect a little bit of copyright, and they go way overboard with that sometimes. But even the DMCA has exceptions for personal information and protecting your own personal information. So, what is the CFAA? It's the law used to prosecute hackers. Everybody here should know about this. If you're here, you should know about the CFAA. And sometimes it is a good thing. Sometimes people do malicious, destructive things for bad reasons, and they should be prosecuted. I remember reading about the very first insider CFAA prosecution. A fellow, he was promoted from sheet metal, and he took all the backups home and left a dead man's script. And so when they fired him, he blew away the system. So sometimes it's a good thing to have that hammer to prosecute people, but it's indiscriminate the way the law is written. It's completely indiscriminate. It doesn't evaluate whether this is something for the public good or something for personal vengeance or personal enrichment. There is some provision in the law for personal enrichment that's supposed to elevate it to a felony. However, the way the law is written, also what elevates it to a felony is a conviction in conjunction with any other law. And almost every state has a law that's almost identical to the CFAA, if not completely identical. And so because we have these identical laws, every instance where the Justice Department starts to investigate, they can bring in felony charges because of the state-federal duality. But the last line, to me, is the biggest issue. Congress wants to make the world a safer place. Congress wants to make our computer systems safer. Great. Give the security researchers the tools they need to make the system safer, not tie the hands of the computer or the security researchers, which is what the CFAA currently does. You can't write a law to protect a computer system. It just doesn't work. But that's the only tool that Congress has in their toolbox, so everything looks like a nail. So, yes, defensive, offensive security. When budgets are considered, well, we can get somebody if they break in, so it's not as important to have as good a security. That's kind of a scary argument to me, but I've heard it. Yeah, Congress. So that's pretty much the bulk of my talk. I said I'd be brief. So if there are any questions. So here's my contact information if you'd like to speak with me further. I'll be around. I'm headed over to the EFF fundraiser party at the summit, and I'll be working the door for a while, so later tonight. So hope to see you there.